When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us every week for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Gregg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. Welcome to this episode of the podcast, Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. Hi, Gregg.
Hi, Janet. It's nice to see you.
It's good to see you. So we have a really interesting theme for today, which is honoring Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King Day, which it comes once a year, and we want to talk about that holiday, what it means for us as oldish people. So I thought I'd start with just a little bit of the history of where this came from and who is Martin Luther King. And then I know we're going to talk a little bit about what does Martin Luther King mean to each of us and what has he meant to us over the years. Ronald Reagan signed a bill on November 2nd, 1983, and it was called the King Holiday Bill. And he said it would be the third Monday in January each year. This happened 15 years after Martin Luther King's death. So it took a while for our country to think about honoring MLK in that way. President Reagan said at that time that the purpose of this bill was to reflect on, act, and honor the enduring legacy of Martin Luther King, who devoted his life to the pursuit of justice and equality. So that was Reagan's statement in 1983. Martin Luther King had been born in January 15th of 1929. So that was some of the thinking around having his MLK Day be in January, because that was his birth month. Martin Luther King became well known and famous because of his work in civil rights. And he came to national recognition when he participated in the battle for civil rights in 1955 regarding Rosa Parks. And that was the Montgomery bus boycott following Rosa Parks' arrest. And Martin Luther King came to Montgomery at that time to be there and be a figurehead in the battle for civil rights. And for anyone who doesn't know who Rosa Parks was, she was a young woman who decided that she wasn't going to get up and move when a white person demanded that she give up her seat for them. And she just took a stand by sitting and got arrested, and Martin Luther King came in for that. So even though Reagan signed that into law in 1983, it didn't become a federal holiday until 1986, where it began to be officially recognized. And just a little bit more about him as far as he was assassinated in April of 1968. So let's think about, for us and all of our listeners, where were you in that moment in 1968? What do you remember about that time? He was on the balcony of a hotel in Tennessee. That was 56 years ago this year. The other input from presidents was that President Clinton in 1994 connected Martin Luther King Day with volunteerism during the holiday. So he wrote, with acts of civic work and community service. Just another little fact that many of us probably knew already was that in this time, Martin Luther King was considered radical, his views, and then he became the subject of several formal FBI surveillance investigations. So it's just interesting to notice, as we have over the years, what creative, out of the box thinking that focuses on equality for all can cause so much backlash and danger and violence. And lastly, he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And then he was murdered in 1968. So it's a little bit of the history of Martin Luther King Day.
One of the things that we've done with holidays in our podcast is we've talked about, now that we're oldish, how does this holiday look different to us? And we should do that with Martin Luther King Day as well, but also, how does the world look different to us in our oldishness because of Martin Luther King? So much of what we take for granted maybe in our country is because Martin Luther King not only took a stand, which was really crucial, but even more important, I think, was the fact that he took a stand that included nonviolence and eliminated from the larger movement, to the extent that he could, the idea that civil rights could or even should be won using violent methods. And he said over and over again that, violence is going to make it worse, not better. And if we resort to violence, then we stop having a claim to rights as a free people or as a intelligent people. I think largely because he was he wasn't a politician. He was really a preacher. He was always referred to, as far as I can remember, as the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He was the Reverend. And he was I believe he was a Baptist minister. His church was in Atlanta, and he was
Right.
very influential as a minister, and made the point that Christians should be nonviolent, that Jesus is an example. Certainly, if Jesus was the Son of God and had the powers that he presumably had as the Son of God, we could have stopped the Romans stringing him up, but he didn't. And something that I always refer back to when I'm talking about nonviolence, especially to Christians, is that at the key moment, one of the key moments in Christianity toward the end, when Jesus was praying in the garden and the Roman soldiers came to arrest him, Peter drew a sword and cut off the ear of one of the Roman soldiers. And Jesus said, no, you can't do that. Not even to protect someone that you are sure is the Messiah. You can't do that. I think that's where the quote, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword, came from. And the Reverend Martin Luther King took that to heart and really embodied that in his life and insisted on that as a measure of success, was that if you're working nonviolently, which isn't the same thing as to say you just let stuff happen. One of his techniques that I always thought of as being something that he originated was the sit-in, where you just go to the lunch counter and you sit there. If your people can't be served at the lunch counter because of racism, really, you don't blow up the lunch counter, you go and sit there. If you can, you organize thousands of people to go and sit somewhere and block the activities that are harmful to you. Just don't let them happen. And that, I think, is really a key to his message, and certainly why he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. If he'd have been a armed revolutionary, he wasn't going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, that's for sure. And he connected it directly to his belief, his religion. And that's the kind of hero that, and when I was growing up, that's what appealed to me really about his character, was that he was someone, my own belief in my religion was coming apart because I saw so much hypocrisy in the organized churches around me. And here was someone who at least in that way. And I know that people have tried to disparage his personal life forever for probably with ill intent. But at least as far as his expression of his Christian beliefs, he did it the way that Jesus intended, I think.
Absolutely. And it makes me think about Gandhi, who wanted so much for that to be true for his part of the world in India of nonviolence. I did read about that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s father was a pastor. MLK followed in his father's footsteps, then brought with him into his work as a pastor strong belief in nonviolence.
So let's talk a little bit about, as we often have done, about how is our world different and how do all these questions look different now that we're oldish and we're not old yet, but how do these things look different to us? How does the world look different? I think is a very important question. The world is different now, is no doubt. The world that we live in now is different in very real ways than it would have been at our same ages in the 1960s. If I were 73 years old in 1953 or 1963, the world would be very different from what it is now, 60 years later. So how did Martin Luther King's work impact my life as an oldish person? And I think there are some very clear ways. What do you think of that question?
Well, it makes me think about my whole journey in my lifetime from awareness of Martin Luther King and his death and onward. I think at this moment in my life as an oldish person, I feel in general kind of discouraged. I feel disheartened. When he was assassinated, I was 15, I think, it was 1968. And before he was assassinated, for me personally, as a biracial girl who didn't necessarily know for sure that I was biracial, but I did know in the depths of my heart, for him to be doing that work that intimately impacted me was so encouraging and inspiring and heartening. And then to have him killed was just, as a teenager, just felt like I didn't even know how to process it. And then to have right at the same time, our President Kennedy assassinated, his brother Robert Kennedy assassinated, Malcolm X assassinated, all in a relatively short period of time. It felt like, to me, the end for me, of optimism. And I didn't give up, but I did feel a real shift in almost like a naive belief that these people were going to make a difference that would last forever. And I do know I have one anecdote about my own life personally, is that because I was adopted into a white family and my parents decided not to tell me that I was biracial, I found out later in my adult life, after my parents had died, that my mom, who was very aware that I was biracial, when Martin Luther King came to prominence in the mid 50s, early 60s, that my mom said to her best friend, "I've been praying every day that when Janet grows up, she would be safe. I didn't know that my prayers would be answered for so many people." And that's just such an amazing story for me, and kind of mirrors what that felt like as far as possibilities. And he did make a big difference, and that difference does continue. So when you ask, like, how does life look different for me now, along with that sense of discouragement is also an awareness that one person can make such a difference, and people can make such a difference, and that his work made a big difference, and we need more Martin Luther Kings.
We sure do. I have a feeling about the world now is I'm doing my best to be optimistic. And my sense of the world is these days is that the world that I live in still displays a lot of prejudice, a lot of discrimination, some of it racial, some of it gender-based, some of it ethnic. So there's still a lot of that,
Yeah.
but there's a counterbalance in that people can stand up and say, you can't act that way, that's racist. Whereas back in the 50s, people weren't saying that as readily. But I think that the civil rights for African Americans is something that's way better than it was in the 50s. There was still racism in America. I'm not saying that the racism has all gone away. There's still sexism in America. But I think the movements for civil rights for African Americans and women and people of color and LGBTQ people and immigrants and so on is a struggle that's more visible and more joinable than it was prior to Martin Luther King energizing people the way that he did and making a sacrifice the way that he did. He was, in that way, a Christ-like figure. It was the assassination, it was the crucifixion that made Christianity. And for the same reasons, for the power of love, to act like you love people is a radical act. And it's often met with hostility and pushback. And I think that racism dominated, I'll just go back to racism for a second. Racism dominated what we think of as the American culture. Still does, but nowhere near as much. People of color can, for the most part, go in and sit down on a bus. People of color can go in and sit down and eat at the diner. People of color are at least generically better off. The big laws aren't against them anymore. The small prejudices certainly are. My sister, before she passed away, made a comment that there wasn't any racism where we grew up. And I got to point out to her that the town we grew up in north of Boston, there weren't any laws against it, but the people who lived there did not allow people of color to live in our town. That's no longer the case.
So I just want to jump in a little bit. And this is some of my struggle is that I have to remember the ways that things are better for people of color. And so I can say for myself that I didn't, growing up in a white culture, family, neighborhood, school, church, and on TV, I didn't see any Black people who had I just didn't see Black people in my life. And then on TV, the only Black people I saw were bad people, robbers and drug people and things. And as I've lived over these years and seen, like the first time I saw a model in a catalog who was Black, I had to rip out that piece of paper and put it up on my refrigerator. I was in my early 30s probably, because I was so amazed that here was this image of beauty that was Black beauty. And first time that I saw a Black baby on a diaper bag, diapers you could buy, disposable diapers, I had to buy it even though I didn't use disposable diapers because I was so excited to see this adorable, cute little baby on the diaper bags. And of course, now we see actors who are Black who are honored and win awards and directors who are Black and all that Black people are more represented in various avenues. But I'm also really discouraged because then I learn about how racism continues in our country and what you said a few minutes ago about people of color being able to live wherever they want. That's absolutely not true. In certain places, if the realtor knows you're Black, they're going to try to steer you towards a different part of town or even someone trying to sell their house. If they have anything that lets the potential buyer know that the house was lived in and owned by someone who's Black will lower the chances that the house is sold. So people who are Black are instructed to take down all of their artwork that is Black themed etc., so that they have a better chance of selling their house. Then we think about the high school to prison pipeline for kids of color, especially males. And that so much is so disheartening to me. And the fact that Obama became president, but then after him, who was elected was one of the most racist, outwardly racist presidents we've had. So I guess that's what's hard for me as an oldish person, is that I guess I was hoping that it would be more accepted, celebrated diversity, that diversity was more accepted, celebrated, and that means that there would be less hate and less fear of things that are different. And there'd be less, instead of going towards judgment and protection and exclusion, we would go towards acceptance and curiosity and enjoyment of what's different. And so I don't know. That's my dilemma at 70.
Yeah, that's certainly very reasonable. I don't want to imply that I think things are all hunky-dory, because things are definitely not hunky-dory.
Mhm.
There's still racism and sexism and homophobia and, you name it. There's no shortage of lost opportunities for love in the world. There's no question about that.
There's more police brutality, or there's police brutality that continues, and parents who are people of color have to have those talks with their kids as they get to a certain age, like, this is what it's going to mean to drive a car. And if you're my son and you have brown skin, you're going to get pulled over a lot. And this is what you need to do to de-escalate the situation before it gets heated. That's like really sad. And knowing that you could just reach for something in your glove compartment and get shot. Or you could be walking somewhere and you could get shot. Or the police could open your door and they might be at the wrong door, but they're going to shoot you because they see that you're black and that makes them scared. And so I think that the right response, or the correct response, is things are getting better and we're moving in the right direction. Yeah. But I don't always feel that way.
Yeah, I feel like things are getting better and we are moving in the right direction, but we ain't there yet by a long stretch. There's still a long road ahead. Yeah. But to the extent that my life as an oldest person is much richer in a lot of ways because of Martin Luther King and the work that he did and the work of the people who's followed on after. You mentioned you can see black people. My life, people aren't always automatically excluded because of the color. It's not nobody notices the color of their skin by a long stretch, but and this is only slightly off on that, but you talked about the origin of the holiday. And in the early days of Martin Luther King Day, there were cities and states that refused to have a Martin Luther King Day. They refused to make it a holiday. And what I can remember from then was there were a lot of people, athletes, musicians, performers, who are not going to play we won't play in your city anymore. And that demonstrated a social and economic power that certainly hadn't existed in the black athlete in the 1950s was, for the most part, relegated to black-only baseball teams, for example, until Jackie Robinson and some other folks. And I grew up in Boston, and I can still remember the real crap that was done to the first Boston Red Sox players who were, and even after winning multiple championships for the Boston Celtics, players, Bill Russell. The anecdote that I remember from my teenage years was that one of Bill Russell's teammates, a guy named Sam Jones, and this story on the podcast bar, Sam Jones, who was a Hall of Fame basketball player, wanted to buy a house in the town that I grew up in. And the neighbors heard that, and they got together and bought the house. When I made a reference to the town that I grew up in is no longer segregated like that. It's no longer discriminated like that. There are people of lots of different colors who live in that town. So the town is way more. There was white Christians and Jews when I was growing up, and anybody else was not allowed. My life in general is, I think, improved because Martin. If nothing else, if it hadn't been for Martin Luther King, would you and I be having?
Well, one of the things that I'm thinking about of how he impacted my life in such a profound way is that before he made all this change, if that the way the life was going pre Martin Luther King, I was on a path without knowing it of that I might have ended up being a person of color who passed for white. And I think that that's what my parents had in mind as far as why they never told me, because Black people were doing that. It sometimes was the best way to open doors to college and work and places to live is if you were white. And I think my parents were grooming me for that as a safety precaution. And so yeah, I don't think you and I'd be talking about this for all sorts of reasons, including that I would not be talking as a biracial African American woman.
Both all three sides, biracial African American woman, in the 1950s, it must have been, whenever was it, whatever decade it was in, where you decided that you wanted to change careers and go to school and earn a professional degree and professional licensure in a highly valued field in the 1950s, you would have had to have been Martin Luther King to pull that off. Because of Martin Luther King, you were able to say, I want to go to school and become a psychotherapist. And I've never heard you say that you had to battle the racist infrastructure at the school that you wanted to go to.
But one thing that was interesting was that that was back in, I think, the early 2000s, like 2008, I think I started. But I remember when I went to an open house for the school that I ended up going to, there weren't any people of color presenting for the school. And when they had question and answer, I did go up and ask, what is the representation at this school around people of color? And it was, I think, a young student who had volunteered to do this presentation. And she said, there isn't any. And I had to make that decision that I was going to go, even though, because it was a good school. So even though who I was would be so underrepresented. And I have to say, so this could, fit into the change that Martin Luther King legacy has had, is that I can say now, 15 years later, how many professors are people of color, how many more students are people of color. It's a completely different makeup than 15 years ago. So, those changes are happening.
So I'll go on the record then as saying that, I think it's better, but it's not best. It's not, we're up and walking around, but we're not running. So my life is better. I know that.
Mm-hmm.
I know that my life is better because of Martin Luther King. And I think about that actually fairly often, that my life is better because of Martin Luther King. And an aspect that doesn't have anything to do with racism necessarily is the idea that change can happen nonviolently. The change can happen if you love people and if you act like you love them and if you don't let them do whatever it is that they want to do to keep you down. Martin Luther King wasn't about nonviolent sitting around the house. It was about nonviolent resistance.
Right, which included getting arrested and all sorts of things. She made me think of the singer Sam Cooke and how one of his famous songs is "A Change Is Coming," and how that song then became a major rallying cry during the Martin Luther King movement time, active time.
Yeah, so I think we can agree that we're glad to know each other. And and that part's good. And
Yes.
there's still
Yes.
way lots of room for growth, but we honor Martin Luther King and his legacy and the sacrifices that he made. I often think that if he had, nobody would have really took somebody special and powerful. And
Yeah. And I have to say, as we wind down here, that I'm feeling a little bit better than I was about the state of things post Martin Luther King, and that just to be reminded of how far we have come, even though we have so far to go. All we can do is one day at a time and continue the march forward for equal rights and acceptance and curiosity and celebration.
I think everybody that listens to this should think about where their lives would be without Martin King. And in conclusions, and we would like to have people who are stirred to enter the conversation. We have the ability for people to leave comments on this episode of our podcast, as well as any other ones that they are moved to comment on. Our website includes the ability for people to leave comments and continue. I would like a lot to hear from people. Their oldishness is impacted by, and the folks can find those comments at www.oldish.me. We do have the ability to remove comments that are inappropriate or disrespectful or off by too much. So we're not encouraging people to come and be nasty or argumentative. I don't mind a good argument, but I do prefer an argument that's respectful and is based on thinking.
Honors the nonviolent approach.
There's a question there is what is nonviolent? How are you contributing to the world as an oldish person in nonviolent ways or not? Having said that, Janet, I want to say that I have, as always, enjoyed talking with you about this topic, and I've learned about Luther King and the state of the world. You know, I'm kind of a recluse and bubble, and it's nice to have my book time to time and to have the shades drawn up so that I can see out more clearly. So I start bringing your wisdom.
Until next time, this has been a great
I'm
conversation.
looking forward to it.
Talk to you soon, Gregg.
Bye-bye.
And everyone that's listening. Yes. Bye.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. We enjoyed our visit and hope you did too. You can leave comments or requests for topics or guests on this or other episodes at www.oldish.me. There's a link there too if you've wondered how you can help support our podcast. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.